Hello and welcome to this webinar, Navigating the GLP-1 Disruption, What Future-Ready Leaders Need to Know with Balchem. My name is Megan Tatum. I'm a freelance health and business journalist, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion, where we'll be diving into the disruptive impact of GLP-1s. First, a short bit of housekeeping. If you experience any technical difficulties while watching, please refresh your browser as this clears up most problems. But if that doesn't help, just type your issue into the Q&A box and a member of our technical team will help you. You should see a resources panel on your screen where you can access useful links relating to today's topic. Now, as use of GLP-1 steadily grows, its impact on food, beverages and supplements can't be overstated, inspiring a raft of new product innovation and GLP-1 friendly positioning. In today's session, our experts will share insights on how manufacturers can respond to this fundamental shift in the consumer landscape. They'll share the latest on where innovation is heading, from protein-forward concepts to solutions for muscle preservation, hydration and nutrient gaps, and also flag emerging opportunities across functional beverages, healthy snacking, and dietary supplements. We're joined by Dominic Matten, VP of Marketing, Science and Business Development at Balchem Human Nutrition and Health. With more than 25 years on the global stage, Dominic is known for turning sharp scientific insight into standout brands, meaningful platforms, and growth that lasts. Also joining us is Don Johnson, a principal in the EY Parthenon Consumer Strategy Practice. Don has over 20 years of experience helping consumer and retail organizations drive growth and transformation. So without further ado, over to you, Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. And before I kick off with my slides, I want to say welcome everybody. And thank you for joining us today. We're excited to have you here to explore one of the most talked about topics in our nutrition industry these days, which is GLP-1. And over the next session, we will unpack consumer trends, consumer patterns, science insights. We share practical tips and hopefully spark off a few new ideas along the way. I am Dominic Matten. I'm the VP Marketing, Business Development and Science for Balchem, and I'm representing our company here, which has just become a 1 billion company last year with about 1,400 colleagues around the world. And we are a company specialized in a global organization that is specialized in science-backed ingredients and solutions for the food and beverage industries that are proven in science and precision manufacturing. So we are partnering with brands around the world to turn these nutritional insights and these scientific findings into meaningful health solutions, helping people live healthier lives every day. And our vision is to make the world a healthier place. So the questions we're going to address today are, first of all, what is GLP-1? Before we then go into looking into some of the consumption trends in consumer packaged goods and retail, and then follow up with how the whole GLP-1 movement is affecting the food industry and how industries can respond before we then sum up in the final part of this webinar. So let's get started. Let's get right in talking about what is GLP-1. And I have a bit of a definition here. GLP-1 stands for glucagon-like peptide 1. It's a hormone that you have naturally in the gut, and it's naturally triggered after eating. The main roles are to regulate blood sugar by stimulating insulin secretion and suppressing glucagon secretion, and it also has an effect on the gastric emptying time, which prolongs satiety, and it acts on the brain to reduce hunger and food cravings. When you look on the right, then what is GLP-1 receptor analog? So what is the medication? That's nothing else than mimicking the GLP-1 actions you would have naturally when you consume food. The examples are Ozempic, Wegovy, for example. These are the ones that are most known and talked about. And these drugs have originally been developed to treat type 2 diabetes, but now they're widely used for weight loss management, obesity treatment, and even cardiovascular risk reduction. And it's interesting to note that people with obesity often have lower GLP-1 activity. On the next slide, you see the mechanism of action of these drugs. And I just want to call out the brain here and the effects on appetite reduction, and also the stomach on the right side, and the fact that the gastric emptying time is depressed and slowed down. And this, of course, results ultimately in higher satiety, a higher feeling of fullness, which in turn then results in less caloric intake and consequently, logically, in less body weight. At this point, I would like to hand over to Don Johnson from Ernst and Young Parthenon, who's going to talk about how this GLP-1 effect or movement has reshaped consumption trends in consumer packaged goods and retail. Over to you, Don.
So thank you, Dominic, for the nice introduction. At EY Parthenon, over the last few years, we've been trying to understand the implications of GLP-1 drugs and how they're going to impact consumer products, particularly in sort of food and snacking and beverages. So in 2024, we undertook our very first survey of consumers to understand how these products and drugs were penetrating our society. And then over the past 2 years, we have continued that to understand the implications around GLP-1 drugs and what they are doing to consumption. We've just launched our third survey, and so it is currently in field, and we're hoping to get results in sort of mid-spring. In 2024, we found that there had been about 9% of the US adult population had adopted GLP-1s, and about 6% of them were actively using at that time. And there were 3% that were lapsed users, people that had begun to use the products, but then had stopped using the products for a variety of reasons. We also wanted to understand why some people were not adopting. And so as you see on the right-hand side of this, we were looking for some of the barriers to adoption. There was a big concern among side effects. There was a big concern around cost. And then at that time in 2024, there was also a question around being able to obtain a doctor's recommendation or a prescription. We'll come back to these because, 2 years doesn't seem like a long time, but a lot has changed in 2 years. Also at that time, we understood that there were two distinct groups of folks using GLP-1 drugs. There was a group that we would call sort of health management, folks primarily with a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. And then there was a group that we were primarily designating as weight management. And they split roughly 2/3, 1/3, respectively. And then the final thing that you'll see on this page is we started to ask the GLP-1 users, what were they increasing in terms of their consumption in 2024? And so you see a dramatic shift, particularly among the weight management group, of more fruits and vegetables, more proteins, more specialty and health foods. And so while we will talk about the broader adoption of GLP-1s, a lot of the work that we focused on has to do with this weight management group, because they are, to some degree, choosing to be on the drugs for a variety of reasons versus it being a matter of sort of, medical necessity because you have a type 2 diabetes diagnosis. So let's talk a little bit more about these groups. So as we said, in 2024, we discovered that there are two distinct groups. And so the weight management group, we found at that time was a little bit younger, a little bit more affluent than the health management group, and a little bit more female relative to the health management group, and looking somewhat like the general population of the US. Fast forwarding to 2025, repeating the same survey, we found that adoption had significantly increased. So we had about 16% of the adult population had tried or had been on GLP-1s, of which 11% were active users and 5% were lapsed users. And as you recall, in 2025, this all predates the oral form of the drug that just came out in the winter of 2026. So we're expecting in our new survey to see a significant uptick even from these numbers. We also took a look at some of the concerns for barriers for why people weren't using. And you continue to see a concern around side effects, though it is decreasing. There is a concern around long-term effects, and then cost is still clearly rearing its head, albeit that is also starting to decline. And a lot of that has to do with their new outlets and more ways to obtain these drugs. And certainly in 2024, the weight management wasn't necessarily one of the primary drivers of adoption. But now that we see many more versions of these drugs specifically for weight management, we're not surprised to see these numbers change. What we also looked at was we got very curious about the lapsed users and their behaviors, because we were kind of curious as to what were the implications for CPG companies, for people that not only use the drugs, but also decided to stop using the drugs, specifically amongst sort of the weight management group. So we found two things. First, most of the lapsed users were in the weight management group. And then what we also found was that the weight management, we're curious, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, as to whether or not some of those behaviors were sticky, even when they were not on the drugs. We understand, obviously, that the caloric intake is going to increase when you're no longer on the drugs, but the question is, what is the mix of calories once you stop taking the drugs? The final thing that you see on this page, because we did some deep dives in 2025 to better understand the percentage of consumers that were saying that they were changing their consumption in certain categories. And what you see here is that 70% of consumers on GLP-1 drugs were saying that they were decreasing their snacking consumption. 45% said that they were decreasing their alcohol consumption, and 60% said that they were changing their food away from home consumption. So as we dug into the lapsed users, we really wanted to understand who they were, as well as who the GLP-1 drug users were, and how the lapsed users might look different, because we wanted to understand some of the drivers of lapsing. So the first thing that we see is that the lapsers are less affluent than the weight management folks that continue to stay on GLP-1 drugs. And that makes a lot of sense to us, because as you look on the right side, the primary reason for stopping is the cost of the medication. And then you see side effects coming in, second place, but with a significant gap next to sort of the cost of the medication. And then there's a small percentage of people that say that they had reached their desired weight. We had a hypothesis going into the survey that maybe the reaching the target weight was going to be the primary driver for stopping, but we find that while that is a reason, and it is a reasonably significant reason, it's not the primary reason that people stop using the GLP-1 drugs and fall into what we call sort of lapsing behavior. So then we asked ourselves a question around sort of the lapsed behavior. How sticky is the behavior that you've found that the drug sort of enabled once you stop? And so we found that while clearly your caloric consumption starts to increase, we see that at least there's a mindset for a lot of the lapsed users that they want to at least try to maintain some of the behavior, and they're doing a reasonably decent job, as you can see on the right side, at least in the early months, of actually maintaining some of the behavior of eating differently, more proteins, less sugar, less fats. Over time, certainly that erodes because your body goes back to requiring more calories. But we were kind of curious about this. And the reason that we were curious about it is because as we think about some of the CPG clients that we have, we recognize that the GLP-1 drugs, particularly for the weight management group, they create this sort of structural barrier where consumption declines in many of the categories. And we'll talk about this. But also we were wondering if that behavior was potentially sticky, so that there was not necessarily a bounce back in terms of the volume and the purchasing behaviors once you were off the drugs, particularly for the weight management group. And our hypothesis is that, yes, this actually does exist. And so there is certainly some of the continued behavior. Before we jump into one of the specific categories to understand specifically how the behaviors have changed, one of the things that we have tried to do, and we will continue to try to do, is understand where is the penetration going and what are some of the key drivers. And this is obviously always a moving target, particularly with new forms of the drug and some of the barriers coming down. But we believe that over the course of a 10-year time frame, we're likely to see upwards of perhaps a third of the adult population in the US adopt these drugs at some point in time. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, because they're becoming more widely available. Two, because they're becoming more widely available in different forms, so pills as an example. And then the third thing that we see is that there are more sort of indications for the drugs in terms of things that they can treat. And the more things that these drugs can treat, the more likely we're to at least see some degree of adoption. And while we're, trying to understand the degree of stickiness of that behavior, we believe that the more indications for the drugs being used, the more likely people are to stick to this, such as decreasing inflammation or fighting sleep apnea. And so we do believe that we're going to continue to see sort of this upward trajectory over the next 5 to 10 years as these drugs continue to evolve. So one thing that we've done over the course of the few years is take a deep dive into some of the specific food categories to understand the implications of these drugs and what's actually happening at sort of the quote unquote ground level in terms of behaviors. So today I'll sort of walk you through some of the behaviors we found in terms of snacks, both salty and sweet. So snacking, as we mentioned, faces the highest level of disruption, where 70% of users report decreasing their consumption after starting GLP-1s. And what you see on the right-hand side of this chart is we actually asked sort of a before and after picture. And so most of the GLP-1 users reported consuming snacks, both salty and sweet, more than 5 times a week. Prior to using GLP-1s. And then on the left side, you can see that 70% of the folks say that they actually decrease their behavior. It doesn't mean that they're cutting out snacking altogether. They're certainly not. But it does mean that they're eating less snacks, fewer snacks over time as they're on the GLP-1 drugs. And the rationale for why they're changing their snacking consumption sort of runs the gamut. The biggest is, they've lost their appetite, or their changes are shifting. The other thing that you see is for sort of weight management. Simply, they're recognizing that they need to have sort of more healthy snacking in their diet and less sort of what I would call sort of empty snacking. And so that's a significant chunk right after sort of loss of appetite. And then you see other factors that I think are driving a lot of the behavior. Increased awareness of health and wellness. And we talked about this earlier, particularly for sort of the weight management folks that are keenly aware of the things that they're putting in their mouths and in their stomachs. And then certainly you can see that there's sort of changes in lifestyle that lead to them saying that they feel better. And so they don't want to, they're sort of being more voluntary, more of these voluntary behaviors. As we sort of took a look at what they were eating before and after, the gray bar represents sort of the before, and then the blue bar represents the after. You can see that sort of chips and cookies have a significant decrease, whereas you see an increase in protein, an increase in better for you, an increase in sort of low calorie, low sugar, and certainly an increase in sort of fruits and vegetables. And so that's not surprising to us, but it's a significant shift in terms of the diet that has real implications for our clients that make, sort of salty and sweet snacks, but also real implications for our clients that make sort of protein and better for you snacks. One of the things that we've looked at over time is as the GLP-1 users are shopping, what are they looking for on labels? And the two things that stand out here is that there is a shift, downward shift, subtle but real, away from I'm choosing this brand, and two, I'm looking for health benefits first, and then brand gets lower on sort of the hierarchy. Certainly things like flavor are, in my words, it tastes good, price and ingredients actually matter. But I think in the middle of this chart, what's really interesting is seeing that sort of shift to I'm looking for benefits over brand. And that has some implications for our branded goods manufacturers as they think about both what's in their portfolio, but also the resonance and the relevance of their brand in this sort of new GLP-1 age. Some of the things that they're looking for on the ingredient statement: low sugar, high protein, and certainly low protein. No surprises there, but certainly some of the things that are going to stand out in sort of the GLP-1 for GLP-1 users. And certainly as we talked, even if you're a lapsed user, these are the sorts of things that at least for some period of time, they're going to be looking for on the labels. One of the other things that we sort of talked about is the implications for sort of shopping and what it means for the shopping basket if you have someone in your household that is on one of these GLP-1 drugs. And we know that within 6 months of adoption, there's a 5 to 6% decrease in the amount of spend that consumers are spending on their groceries, though there is also a little bit of a shift in some categories that we know from some secondary information. So it may be that the overall basket is decreasing, but as they're looking for protein, they may be willing to spend more on higher quality protein because it becomes a necessary part of their diet. Additionally, we know that savory snacks saw sort of an 11% decline in purchases from the consumers in our survey, and that 30% of the households reported adopting sort of healthier snack alternatives. And this is really consistent with some of the secondary research that we've seen, which says that as a household, even if there's just one member of the household on GLP-1s, you can actually shift the behavior of an entire household, which can have implications for manufacturers in some of these key categories. So as we think about what this means, and as we're launching and fielding our third survey, we're going to be looking for sort of more indications of how these drugs influence sort of appetite and lifestyle choices. What are the implications for some of the consumer packaged goods, grocery and restaurants categories and players in terms of how they think about presenting their offering, how they think about changing their offering, and how they think about changing their portfolio? And then what does it mean for some of the manufacturers and retailers in terms of actually shifting and pivoting to sort of capture some of the opportunities that GLP-1 drugs sort of naturally present in terms of an evolving landscape? So now I'll hand it back over to Dominic to continue to talk about some of the evolution and the implications for a lot of the product categories that Balchem plays in.
Thank you, Don, for these great insights and these perspectives. That's extremely exciting and insightful. And I want to talk about how this affects our industry and how the industry responds, as GLP-1 clearly have gone from scientific terms to household names being discussed and mentioned on TikTok, on social media all over, being discussed in celebrity interviews and in nearly every boardroom. So we want to understand here what this buzz means for companies like ours and companies like yours. So why don't we then just look at how big companies, corporations, multinationals in the industry respond? And let's start with the coffee company Starbucks here, which, believe it or not, is also behind the GLP-1 trend or has been pushed by GLP-1 to focus more on protein, for example, here. And you can see the quote that it's about smaller meals and more about protein and more about fiber. A similar quote here from the Pepsi CEO, who talks about big opportunities from GLP-1 drugs and talking about hydration here, about fiber and protein. So a similar song that he sings. And finally, a third reference and quote from Nestle Health Science that talks about the importance of preserving lean muscle mass, managing digestive upset, and also manage adequate consumption of micronutrients and more. So that really is a bit of the overall feeling and sentiment we get in the market around GLP-1, and it tells volume in terms of how nearly every company is repositioning their portfolio to speak to the wider GLP-1 audience. Now, my story begins here in unpacking the industry response to GLP-1. And if you imagine you're one of the potential GLP-1 users who just lost 20 pounds using, for example, Ozempic, your appetite is different, your taste buds have changed, your priorities have shifted. Certainly, your shopping cart has changed too. And the question now is, what do we need to do to stay relevant for these consumers, and what do we need to do to stay in the shopping cart? And in order to find out, we looked what happened in the market and how the industry responds. And this is a very condensed version of the unpacked findings that are important to stay in the shopping cart and stay in business, if you want to call it like that, in the spirit and in the sense of GLP-1. So on the trend side, which is the first row, really, there is definitely a big re-emergence of interest in weight management. So the positive and negative buzz that GLP-1 brought on the sheer media front is so massive and has catapulted in kind of old category into a buzzy, trendy topic of conversation. The second element we see is that many companies launch what we call GLP-1 companion products, which is not so much extremely new product development, but more repositioning existing products to speak to the GLP-1 audience or to the health gaps that people encounter when they're being on a GLP-1 drug regimen. It sometimes doesn't even mean that products are calling out GLP-1. Sometimes it's just that companies make sure that they are relevant and are found in Google search, for example, or AI search, making sure that a GLP-1 term somewhere comes up, which then directs to the landing page or a product page, which is not so different from the standard product page. In fact, it might not be associated at all to the term GLP-1, but speaks to the user needs of a GLP-1 patient example or lifestyle user. Number three, a wider interest in metabolic health, something we see all over, considering that we have some 30 trillion cells and every cell about a million biochemical reactions every second speaks certainly volume, gives an understanding that we are a biochemical magical machine, and the interest in how nutrients are being digested, macronutrients, micronutrients, and how they affect our body and our wellness of body, mind, and soul is just really, really of high interest. And last but not least, the whole clean and green eating space, which is all about natural and cleaner and clearer labels, also has received a lot of tailwind. So this translates into nutrition essentials, nutritional claims that are in demand, high in protein, high in fiber, nutrient-dense solutions, low calorie, and natural, what I just explained in the sense of less ultra-processed food, more whole foods, more clean label in terms of vegan, vegetarian, plant-based, but also allergen-free, non-GMO, and so on and so forth. In terms of health benefits, the next row, we see topics and themes like muscle preservation, digestive support, blood sugar stability, closing nutrient gaps, and this connection, the idea of hydration and electrolyte balance is important. Metabolic health, I just mentioned. But believe it or not, also the area of hair, skin, and nails is important to the user, all connected to eventually side effects of the drugs or to simply the fact that you lose a lot of body weight and might have a nutrient gap, which results in a certain need state. From a category standpoint, one level further down, the trending categories are dietary supplements, functional beverages, and healthy snacking. When we dive deeper into the nutritional claims, I mentioned protein, I mentioned fiber, I mentioned nutrient density, low calorie, natural. And from left to right, I have here some examples for you, like liquid protein shots to combat muscle loss, or fiber blends that stimulates the GLP-1 hormone naturally, or a whole GLP-1 support supplement range, which is nutrient dense, or even a whole GLP-1 companion food collection, smart and smaller portion size, low calorie, natural, fiber rich, protein rich, nutrient dense, and they have a nice quality stamp here on top. On the right side, labeled high protein, high fiber, and GLP-1 friendly. Looking into the trending categories, we talked about functional beverages. Here's an example from Boost, from Nestle. which is a pre-meal hunger support drink, meaning you take it before you even start your meal. It has, I think, 10 grams of protein. It's low in sugar, 0 sugar, and about 42 calories. So really it is to help you feel satisfied even before you start a meal. In the middle section, we see healthy snacking, meat sticks, of course, 0 grams of sugar and high in protein naturally. And these meat sticks have seen explosive growth, especially in the US. And some of them are even marketed as a kind of a performance stick, have really even a sportive kind of protein-like marketing behind and product packaging and proposition. Dietary supplements to the right as the third trending category. Here again, an example of U theory that is designed to counter nutrient deficiencies, including multivitamins, probiotics, and protein powder. And this range has been developed with an obesity expert or researcher in weight management. And this overview leads me to some opportunities and some priorities in terms of NPD, in terms of new product development. I want to highlight here a research paper. I'm going to concentrate the attention to the right, but it's about the right food selections, about protein, about complex carbohydrates and fiber, where the recommendation goes into healthy fats and fluids. And on the lower side, right-hand corner, nutrient support in terms of making sure that you maintain lean body mass and muscle mass, and that you combat gastrointestinal complaints and symptoms that might be a side effect of GLP-1 support programs or drugs. Talking about the micronutrient and nutrient status, it's interesting to note that usually a majority of us is not even getting the dietary reference intakes for vitamin D, for potassium, for magnesium, for choline and iron. And we find this interesting in the context of GLP-1 when you consider that even the general population is deficient in some of these vitamins and minerals, then it's rather safe to say that somebody on a diet who will have less nutrient intake, less micro and less macronutrients, might also be deficient and ultimately would benefit from supplementation. I want to scribble this by the example of calcium. As dietary changes may increase the likelihood that calcium intake is insufficient due to the reduced overall food intake, we just discussed, but also greater dependence on adequate vitamin D and K2 status. But also the fact that we have seen before there's more of a move towards plant-based diets and fruits and vegetables as presented by Don before. And the interesting fact is that these plant-based foods can include anti-nutrients like phytic acids or oxalates. These are commonly found in many plant-based foods, also such as nuts, grains, and seeds. And you see on the right chart how the fractional calcium absorption is decreasing from milk, which is a good source of calcium, obviously, and is very well, the calcium in milk in dairy is very well absorbed. But as you go into more plant-based foods, you see a diminishing, a general decrease in how these foods are being, or how the calcium in these foods is being absorbed due to the oxalate content that goes up from left to right. I find this an interesting fact to highlight. And this leads us directly into some of the solutions and innovations we have for dietary supplements, some science-backed ingredients to support the special nutritional needs of a GLP-1 user. And we would like to call out the Albion minerals, which are chelated minerals, meaning that these minerals are shielded with 2 amino acids. They're chelated, which is building a kind of protective layer around these minerals. For iron, for magnesium, for calcium, for zinc. And then these chelated minerals support superior absorption in a stomach-friendly form and can be a good solution also in a more pronounced plant-based diet. Choline in the second row or column is a nutrient also called the mother substance of all. It's an epinutrient that more of 90% of the American population, and probably similar to Europeans, are deficient in, and it's has a role in liver and fat metabolism, certainly relevant during fat loss. It also is an integral component of every cell membrane and tied to muscle maintenance, and your brain also needs a regular supply of choline to regulate memory and mood. Last but not least, there's also an opportunity for the first ever multivitamin when you consider choline to be part of a multivitamin, eventually for people on a GLP-1 drug to support nutrient deficiencies or counteract nutrient deficiencies. We just developed a VitaCholine ProFlow, which is a microencapsulated, patented VitaCholine specially designed for the inclusion in multivitamin formulations. Number 3, weight reduction can impact bone density, and vitamin K2 helps direct calcium to the bones in synergy with vitamin D, a great combination, also called the perfect pair. And going further to the right, OptiMSM, there's a reduced consumption. When there's a reduced consumption of nutrients, that can impact the skin, also the skin elasticity and hair strength. And OptiMSM is a great source of sulfur, and it's a compound that supports collagen production and promotes healthy connective tissues. And also for mobility and movement, it helps to reduce post-exercise inflammation, because it's also part of the body's antioxidant system, also part of the master antioxidant glutathione in your body. And on the very right side, LB and creatine magna power. I want to highlight the idea here, the combination of creatine with magnesium to provide cellular energy to working muscles. That also is an interesting combination, and certainly to I want to say superstars in the industry these days, creatine has a lot of traction as well as magnesium. If we continue to look into solutions for functional beverages and healthy snacking, then high fiber and protein applications come to mind. And we have functional nutritional powders called Vital Blend, protein crisps called C-Crisp, and Stabili Pro Fiber. And all of these ingredients and technology platforms can move, for example, in GLP-1 support beverages, which we have designed here to the right, which is a ginger-infused, honey-flavored mix enriched with the Vital Blend Nutra Base and the Stabili Pro Inulin prebiotic fiber. And this is a good source of fiber, obviously, and calcium is also rich in protein and vitamin D. And our teams have created a couple of concept cards and ideas to design and develop GLP-1 support beverages, and we're happy to help you formulate these solutions. And then also on the beverage and healthy snacking side, some ideas here that that are very relevant these days. We talked about the meat snack sticks before, and here we have a product solution called Meat Sure, which are encapsulated acidulants, which are used to control pH and develop acidic flavor profiles and increases process efficiency in ready-to-eat meat products. So these Meat Sure acids can be used as an alternative to traditional fermentation methods, allowing the acids to be directly mixed into the meat emulsion without negatively impacting the meat proteins or breaking down the emulsion itself. And that is really cool for all of these hyped meat sticks that are so much in demand. And on top, on the right, you see what we call our Enjoy beverage system, which are specific SKUs that provide flavor or provide support for flavor and color systems, mouthfeel modifier systems, sweetener systems, stabilizers, and nutrient systems, meaning solutions for beverages that have already vitamins or minerals embedded in the mix. So you see, we are here really not just observers of the trend and of the shift, but also participants. And we are happy to provide solutions. And we are happy if you want to talk to us and our experts about formulation strategies and the science that supports them. Here is an example of a couple of ideas and product concepts we have developed with our science team that can be put on the market and that can be developed together. On top, we have a couple of resources showcasing our GLP-1 solutions, obviously. My team has integrated a QR code here, which you can scan, and this will lead you to our new GLP-1 microsite, where you find most of the elements we discussed today, and also the ability to sign up to our newsletter and get access to our fact sheets, as you can see here on the right side. And with this, I would like to sum it up, and don't want to repeat everything I just said, or explain, but just want to say that GLP-1 is here to stay, that it's reshaping industry needs, that we are very well positioned here to power your success with our science-backed nutrition solutions. And I would like to invite you to visit us at Vitafoods Europe, the next big trade show in our industry, in May in Barcelona, or IFT, which is in July in Chicago. And with this, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us. And we hope the session sparked new ideas, it answered a few questions, and maybe even inspired you for your next formulation. And we're always happy to continue the conversation, and would love to hear from you. Our team is always excited and happy to talk science, to talk solutions, and to talk what's next. With this, again, thank you for taking your time, and I want to hand you back to Megan.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. We really hope you found that session useful and informative as you navigate the ongoing impacts of GLP-1s in your own business. As Dominic says, if you have any further questions, please do reach out to Balchem directly using the contact details on the screen right now. They'd love to hear from you. An exit survey will also pop up after this webinar, and we'd really appreciate it if you could take just a few moments to give us your feedback on today's event. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.